Hello, wonderful welcomes, really appreciate that. Hope you guys all have your book. As you heard, I'm Christina, this is Nathaniel, and I think we're going to have an interesting conversation tonight about, if you're looking for the everything is going to be just fine event, this is not it. Trying not to get too dark and depressed, I will say that when I picked up this book, I knew that it was a big topic, and I knew that I would be affected by it personally, but so much of it being set 1979 speaks to me. That is the year of my birth, and so effectively I went through reading this feeling like there was a whole opportunity over the course of my lifetime that was wasted. So I guess, is it too late? I think that's sort of the biggest question I really have. You outline in so many different ways all the different moments that there were to have big action and all the science behind it. And even then, it's sort of people were asking 40 years ago, was it too late?
Yeah, well, hello everyone. Thanks for coming out. It's good to be with you all on this idyllic campus. I can't believe how gorgeous it is here. And I can't believe anyone does work here when you can sit outside. Is it too late? Yeah, I think one of the reasons I wanted to write about this subject, it's a subject that I, cared about personally and had thought about, deeply over the years. But I felt the reason I wanted to write about it was that I felt that so much of the language we use to discuss it is dishonest or at the least incomplete or inadequate. And so part of that is this question that I think comes up over and over again, is it too late? Of course, climate change, the range of outcomes available to us is vast. There are pathways, as the IPCC says, that will keep us to 1.5 degrees warming over since historical averages. And there are other pathways that will take us to 6 degrees warming. And in between, there's a huge range of outcomes. Even talking about the problem in 0.5 degrees warming is almost euphemistic. Of course, there's a gigantic difference between 1.9 degrees warming and 2 degrees warming, and 2 and 2.1. And I think that level of, it's the same way we talk about, will we beat this thing or will we be defeated? Should we be hopeful? Should we be despairing? There's this strange kind of binary way that we view this now that I think is a byproduct, not intentional, but is a byproduct of this multi-decadal campaign, which I write about in the book, how it formed, propagated by the oil and gas industry with the enthusiastic abetment of the Republican Party, to deny the science. And I think besides all of its success in politicizing the issue and sort of coarsening the public dialogue and sowing ignorance, it's also it's brought the conversation level down to this almost the childish level of will we beat this thing or not? And I feel like this is an adult. This is a complex issue. We're all adults, and we should be able to discuss it in a more sophisticated way and in a more human way. And that's where I felt I could make a contribution instead of engaging in just sort of what seems to me the baseline question of, is the science real, and what's going to happen. Of course, there's a huge amount of uncertainty, and I think it's important to start there and acknowledge that that's the case.
And you open your book with the words, nearly everything we understood about global warming was understood in 1979. It was, if anything, better understood. And I think we're going to talk about several of these scenarios, like these big moments that you detail in such rich, vivid scenes in this book, but that really feels like it wasn't political then. It sort of starts with, a guy learning about this and, hey, does anybody know about this? Like, let's have some more conversations. And then it really, pardon the pun, like snowballed from there.
Yeah, I mean, it's shocking. The most shocking thing about my research in this period, 79 to 89, is the fact that there really is no conversation that we have about this today that wasn't being held verbatim then. And that's not just the science of it. the predictions of warming, but questions about geoengineering, about carbon removal technology, about what to do about the developing world, all of that. But yeah, I in my research, I found this figure of Rafe Pomerantz, who in 1979 was 32, was an activist at Friends of the Earth, politically connected, and he comes across in this EPA document, this obscure coal report, this stray paragraph on page 66 or something, saying that, and by the way, if we continue to burn fossil fuels, the world will become uninhabitable, essentially. And he says, he responds, I think, the way we all respond when we first come to terms with the size of the problem, which is to say, I guess I can't curse here, but holy moly, what, surely I've misunderstood something here, because if this was true, it wouldn't be in the obscure pages of a coal report, it would be on the news every night, and furthermore, surely people in power, people who are intelligent and run this country would have done something already. And then he realizes that that's not the case, and so he takes it upon himself to try to do that. And I think his response is very intuitive, and I identify with it. It's sort of like the first scene in one of those disaster movies where the scientist sort of like sits up late at night and adjusts his glasses, and he says, well, hold on, that's not a meteor, that's an alien spaceship is entering, the atmosphere, and he calls the Joint Chiefs of Staff and all of that. And that's essentially what Rafe does. And I think it's sort of what I think most of us would do, which is essentially to say, we got to, call the police, we got to tell everybody what's happening, and he thinks and he trusts that will work. And the first disillusionment that he has, and I think that we all have, is that that's not enough.
And you start with this choice of proverbs. Actually, the very opening page, a line in that is, "Scoffers delight themselves in scoffing, and fools hate knowledge." And I think that's really revealed over the course of the book, but it starts with a lot of people wanting to know more and reading and having this conversation about science in a way that we're not having a real true conversation now.
Yeah, the original title of, so the book started as a magazine piece in the New York Times Magazine, and the title that I wanted to use that not a single person thought was a good idea was from that proverb, shouts in the street. It's about wisdom, it's an allegory. Wisdom shouts in the street, nobody pays attention, and then later when disaster comes and whirlwinds come, wisdom just laughs when people try to appeal to it for help. And so I thought Shouts in the Streets would be a good title, Shouts in the Street, but I guess it's not. But it's I used it for it's now the title of the first part of the book, because that's what's going on. Rafe and others are just shouting in the street and hoping to get people to pay attention.
And the New York Times Magazine piece, if you didn't read it, you get a good sense of what the book is about, but it's Losing Earth, the Decade We Almost Stopped Climate Change, from 79 to 89.
I changed that too, because I didn't like that subtitle, so
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, that's a longer conversation about why I didn't like it, which I don't need to go into, maybe. Yeah.
Okay. Sounds like a good combo. Yeah. So, sort of getting at this, it is hard to read when you hear these predictions of, long-term disaster is now the best case scenario. Hundreds of millions of people will be forced to run for their lives. From your understanding of the science, which I think you have been studying, and these scenarios just have gotten grimmer, and there's more people causing more of this. Are there any of these actors, we sort of leave them, and that you have a little bit about kind of what they're doing now, but is there any way that this can sort of spark a new look at things?
Is there any way that the book can spark a new look? I didn't write, I think that's one thing that I was very careful not to do. I feel like that so much of the writing on this subject is geared at this sort of question of what should we do next? What's the best way to motivate people to act, and what's the best way for people to act? What are the policy solutions? All of that. And I think those are all really important conversations to have, and they're crucial. And I think there are a lot of great writers who have those conversations. The same way we need good explanatory journalism about science and all of that. I felt where I could make a contribution was to address what I feel like has not been explored in the literature about this subject, which is the human dimension. Which is to say, how is this crisis changing the way that we understand the future, the way we understand our democracy? How is the fact of our inaction over all of these years, how is it making us question whether the ideals that we claim as fundamental to our society, to our democracy, how can we take seriously the idea that we care about equality, justice, you name it, if we allow this to go on? And furthermore, how do we make sense of our failures to this point? I think those are unanswered questions, and they're not easy questions, and they tend to get glossed over pretty easily when the focus is entirely on, well, what's the next thing to do? What's the answer? And I think one thing that's very different today than in the period I wrote about is that the answers are pretty straightforward. There are all these plans. They tend to involve the same elements: some kind of carbon tax, more investment in renewable energy, phasing out of coal, better agricultural practices, and so on. That part is not the hard part. The question is, how do we get people to care? How do people care about this? How do people act on it? And what's the political calculation? And I think in order to have an honest conversation about the policy and the politics, we have to first have an honest conversation about our failures to this point, and our struggles, and our limitations.
You were a novelist, or are a novelist, before you started pursuing journalism, and we talked a little bit about some of your novels backstage, but the book really reads like a spy novel in a way. Like, you're painting these scenes of these just like very interesting, quirky people and their activities, and you get to know a little bit about their life and where they live, and what this moment in time was like. And I wonder, how did you go about your research? How did you get to know what these people were like, 30 and 40 years ago?
Yeah, I interviewed more than 100 people. I went to archives all over the country, presidential papers, National Archives, and I read every news article I could find, published not only in this decade but earlier, about the problem. And it was I have to write the piece as I did it, which is as a narrative, and it's told without an authorial voice. I'm not in it in any way, and it's told from the perspective of these people, which I thought was crucial, because I feel that by entering into the narrative and through empathy, through the main driver of any kind of narrative drama, we have a more intimate path to grappling with some of these larger questions. And what that meant in terms of research was that I just had to spend a lot more time than I expected to try to nail down these events with the level of specificity required. And the New York Times also has this very robust fact-checking operation, so it wasn't enough, for instance, if Rafe Pomerantz said, I remember being at this meeting and pounding the table and saying, the world is going to end if we don't act, or whatever. If the other people in the meeting didn't remember him saying the exact same thing, even if they said, oh yeah, that sounds like something Rafe would say, but I don't really remember it, I couldn't use it, because that's the standard of the Times. So it just meant a lot of going back to people over and over again, a lot of reporting, and I have a newfound respect for historians as a result. But I did feel that this was crucial to the story, because these are the folks, people like Rafe Pomerantz, were grappling with some of these larger issues that we grapple with today, but they were there first. I mean, as one example, when he reads this Cole report in 1979, his wife is 7 months pregnant. Now, my wife is currently 7 months pregnant, and it's a conversation that we have, and I think that people are having more and more often about, is it responsible? What are the ethics of bringing a child into this situation and into the planet at this time when we know where the trajectory is going? And it's a difficult conversation to have, but of course Rafe in 1979 was having that conversation with his own wife, and so I think it's only through narrative that you can access some of those human questions, and so that's why it was worth it to do all of the insane amount of grunt work that was required.
That makes my next question even more, I'm so fascinated by this, because you've got these really deeply reported scenes, especially the 4 days before Ronald Reagan was elected, these guys get in a room, and I think it was almost all guys at that point.
It's mostly all guys.
In Florida, they're at this resort, and you've got direct dialogue happening there. So that was fact-checked, or did you have some direct material?
So there's a meeting, so at the end of essentially the first act, which is after Rafe Pomerantz tells everybody in the Carter administration, urges action, and the science advisor for Carter, Frank Press, he commissions a bunch of reports, and you get to the moment where Congress, through this AIR commission within Congress, assigns 30 experts, including Rafe Pomerantz, to huddle together in this very peculiar place, the Hotel Don Cesar, which is this, also known as the Pink Palace, this resort hotel on the coast of Florida, where Al Capone used to hang out, and F. Scott Fitzgerald and his wife would go after benders. And so for some reason, they go to this place, and their task is to figure out legislation. What are some laws we can pass to try to prevent this global warming? And so they get together, and they all agree, the science is all clear, they all agree on the science, they all agree on the need for action, and they cannot even make a single statement, because there's 30 of them, they're mostly scientists, and they all have various objections, and it's this maddening scene that I think for me perfectly encapsulates some of the challenges, especially when you have a bunch of scientists trying to make policy. But no, I discovered it incredibly. There was someone transcribed it. Congress sent somebody to transcribe it. There's no account of the meeting anywhere that I could find, except there's a file in the National Archives that I came across, and it was one of the few things that I discovered that was this kind of journalistic dream come true, or a historian's dream come true, I guess, in that it reads like a screenplay almost. It's 600 pages, so I could originally when I wrote the scene, it was much longer because there's so much in it. But it's a debate. They have a debate about what to do about climate change, and again, it's every conversation we're having now in great detail, and it's almost and the emotion of the scene escalates as it goes along. It's over a 2 or 3 day session, and Pomerantz is beside himself by the end. He's just, he's pounding the table trying to get people to do something, and no one can agree on a statement. But yeah, a lot of people who were even in that meeting don't remember it. So I'd have to go back to them with direct quotes and say, do you remember what happened when this person said this thing, and so on. But it was, yes, I would not have been able to direct quote from it directly otherwise.
What a find. That's really interesting. So you have this chapter called Heroes and Villains, and you write, this is a little bit later, James Hansen, who, if you guys are passionate about this issue, you probably know that name a little bit, somebody who raised the alarm on this very publicly in this period of time that you write about. You say the front page Times article about James Hansen's paper had proved that there was a natural audience for the carbon dioxide problem. It just had to be framed correctly. And then you talk a little bit about these hearings on Capitol Hill and how scientific reports were framed in the press and even framed sort of not accurately, like tying certain things to other things. But what do you view is the role of the media here, both in this time period you write about and then thinking about it today?
Yeah, well, what's incredible is that this question of, essentially it's a marketing question, how do we get people to care about the issue, has been along almost as long as the science itself was established. So you have Al Gore in 1980, a young congressman trying to make his name, third term, before he's in the Senate, third term congressman, who through this intense effort, he basically creates a new subcommittee in the science committee, just so he can lead it. He's trying to make a name for himself, and it's an oversight committee, and he decides that the best issue for him to elevate his standing is climate change. I mean, it's called global warming or greenhouse effect then, but he thinks it's a PR home run. Here's this issue. It's an existential crisis for the planet. It affects everybody. It's not a partisan issue. And he figures that if he can just get Congress to listen to this message, that it'll take off. And so even at the very beginning of the political process, Gore himself is thinking in terms of, okay, who are the heroes? Who are the villains? How is this going to play on TV? How will we talk to the national news, broadcast?
A former journalist himself, I think, right? Wasn't he before he went into college?
Gore did.
Yeah.
And he also, he had serendipitously at Harvard, Roger Revelle, who is this famous, prominent scientist who was an advisor to presidents, he had taken a class with Revelle at Harvard, in which Revelle talked about global warming. Revelle was in 1957 is the person with a colleague who first brought this to national attention, gave interviews for Time magazine, Life magazine, about how New York would be flooded when the ice caps melted, and he thought, well, surely if I can just get Roger Revelle to tell Congress what he told my lecture class, we'll have transformative action. And again, it's not enough. But you see over the course of the decade that these activists and scientists and politicians are not only engaged in a political battle, but they're engaged in a kind of public relations battle. Maybe the two are the same ultimately anyway, but they're thinking in very strategic terms. It's the same kind of thinking that you see at the end of the decade when James Hansen, the NASA scientist, who is appearing before Congress just about every year to talk about this issue. After 1987, when he appears in November, and nobody cares, again, he says, that's it. From now on, we're going to have global warming hearings. It has to happen in the middle of the summer. And sure enough, the next summer, they hold another hearing. Gore holds it in the Senate, and it's the hottest summer of all time. And that's the moment where the issue jumps into the national prominence in a dramatic way.
Yeah, I love that scene. Having lived in DC for 12 years and thinking about that sweltering humidity, I could very much visualize that. So there's also this moment that it appears very hopeful, right? There was this big thing that happened, the hole in the ozone layer, which, as you describe, is not even actually scientifically quite accurate. But that seemed to be really effective. Hairspray changed. It was this moment everybody was talking about. Is there a marketing and PR campaign to frame it to have a similar moment?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so basically, after the Pink Palace, 4 days later, Reagan's elected, and there's a huge comprehensive government report that takes years to be produced that in 1983 finally comes out that confirms the science, but the conclusion of this august team of sort of scientific figures, including Revelle, who reviews it, they conclude, well, there's just, this is a scary thing that's happening, but let's be cautious, let's not panic, we don't need to act right now. And that, combined with Reagan's general attack on environmentalism and regulation in all of its forms, kills the issue for a few years, and Rafe kind of goes into the wilderness. And then the ozone hole comes around, and people freak out about the hole in the ozone layer to a degree that that frankly Pomerantz is almost envious of. He realizes that this has taken a hold of the public imagination in a way that the greenhouse effect has never done by that point. And and so one of my big fights, this is maybe a petty thing to talk about, but one of my big fights with my editors was in writing about the public hysteria about this issue. People thought that they would go blind. The radiation of the sun would burst through the sky and cause them to get skin cancer. And one activist said at the time, this is like in the mid 80s, this is like AIDS from the sky, which is maybe in bad taste, but I felt like perfectly captured the hysteria of the moment. But the Times would not let me use that. They thought it was too silly. But I think that sort of perfectly captures the And so yes, and Rafe basically realizes that this is another global climate issue, and unlike the greenhouse effect, there's a solution, which is this international treaty that's then in development and ultimately successful, the Montreal Protocol. And they figure out that if we can hitch global warming to the ozone hole, we might have a shot. And so they have these double-barreled hearings in 1986 in the Senate. Republican Senator John Chafee has. And sure enough, it works. And it transfers over. And that's the beginning of a kind of rapid ascension of the issue towards a solution that's patterned exactly after ozone, which is a global treaty to reduce carbon emissions. And so it works. Of course, the problems are very different, and it much easier to solve the ozone crisis than the CO2. But yes, politically, it gives him a lever.
And then there's this bit, I really was suffering deja vu when I read about this right after this moment you just talked about in 1986, then it continues picking up speed. In 1987 alone, there were 8 days of climate hearings in 3 committees. Joe Biden was introducing legislation. And I read that, I thought this sentence could have been written in 2007 when I was covering the Senate, everybody was about to run for president, and the Democrats had just taken over Congress, and there was this huge momentum in a select committee, and they banned the plasticware in the House committees and in the cafeteria. I guess it's not a huge shock, but it just
it is pretty shocking. I mean, what's also shocking is it accelerates. 1988, there are 32 climate bills introduced in Congress after Hansen's hearing. Some of those bills, bipartisan bills, which are real legislative packages that have already withstood some compromise and negotiation, are more ambitious in many ways than even the Green New Deal that you have today. There are bills about addressing population control, which no one talks about now, nuclear energy, sanctions for countries that fail to live up to their commitments to reduce emissions. And so you have bills like this backed by, in one case, one of the most ambitious ones from Claudine Schneider, a Republican from Rhode Island, kind of Republican that no longer exists, something like 150 co-sponsors in the House. And you have George H.W. Bush running to the left of Dukakis in 1988, saying things like, on this issue, saying things like, those who think we can't solve the greenhouse effect haven't heard about the White House effect, and when I'm in the White House, we will solve it. And so that's where we are in 1988, and it's, as much as the story is a tragedy, maybe the greatest tragedy of our civilization, it's also the story of the triumph of this movement by really a handful of people to move the issue from scientific, research papers to global diplomatic, debate, and that's sort of that's the crest. And it seems like the momentum at that point, 88, early 89, it seems that the momentum is unstoppable.
And then there's another villain, John Sununu.
Yeah, the real dark hat of the story is Sununu, who's a really fascinating guy. He's patient zero for climate denialism. He's chief of staff for Bush. Bush gives him the position after he's credited with delivering the Republican nomination to Bush. Bush had lost in Iowa in the primary, and Sununu, two-term governor of New Hampshire, used the full force of his, the political machine in New Hampshire to deliver that primary to Bush, set him on a glide path to the candidacy, was given the choice of any job in the administration. Bush gave him chief of staff. And Sununu, despite his political prowess, considered himself still a scientist. He had a PhD in engineering. He had taught at MIT, courses about science and policy. And he was very skeptical about the science. And he's skeptical based on his own scientific training. He had done some work with computer models, and he was very skeptical, albeit a very different kind of computer modeling than was used by people like James Hansen, who had these very complex models that were essentially future prediction machines about climate. And so he was very skeptical about these predictions. And then he also had this sort of, I find, fairly tortured conspiracy theory about leftist, sort of globalist forces using science to advance what he calls anti-growth policy. So the population scares of the 70s, that the world was headed towards overpopulation and we need to curb growth. That was one example, 1A for him. And he thought climate change was another iteration of this. And so that kind of thinking is, a version of that is now basically central ideology for the Republican Party, but at the time, no one understood what he was talking about. He had to explain it to other people in the administration, and he ended up rallying a couple of people, a couple of close allies, Alan Bromley, the science advisor, who he had picked for the position, and Dick Darman, the head of OMB. And so you have playing out at the beginning of Bush's term this tug of war between Sununu on one side and William Riley, who's the head of the EPA and very strongly in support of this climate treaty process that's now just beginning. Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UN global climate change body, is just formed, having its first meetings about a treaty based on the Ozone Treaty. And basically Bush himself, his public statements after he enters office vacillate between extremes based on whoever wrote his last speech or whoever handed him the last talking points over the course of that year. And at one point, like two squabbling children, siblings, Sununu and Riley go to Bush and they say, essentially, we're at an impasse. We disagree about what should be done. And Bush says, oh, you guys figure it out and then get back to me. That's his level of engagement. And Sununu, as the more powerful, ultimately the more powerful person in the administration, wins out. And what that means is he's able to force the U.S., at the first high-level diplomatic meeting to negotiate the framework of this treaty, to withdraw from any commitment to reduce emissions or to have targets.
And do you pronounce this Nordwich?
Nordwijk, yeah. But I don't speak Dutch, so that's my best.
I wrote it down, Noordwijck. But let me just read this, because basically after these closed-door meetings, and Sununu had said, like, sort of his guy, Bromley, who you mentioned, the final statement noted only that many nations supported stabilizing emissions, but it did not indicate which nations, or at what level, or by what deadline. And with that, a decade of excruciating, painful, exhilarating progress turned to air. And I read that, and then we have news, I guess it was yesterday, that Mike Bloomberg is putting in, the number actually sounds kind of small, $5.5 million to the United Nations Climate Change Secretariat to fill the gap left by the Trump administration to make sure the U.S. meets the Paris Agreement goals.
Yeah, so we're still in that process. The IPCC process, decades later, continues. The treaties have become less. The commitments have become weaker and weaker until you get to the Paris Accord, which is voluntary. Every country sets its own benchmarks, and in fact, already a couple of years into it, is largely unheeded by almost every country in it. And I asked Sununu at one point I spoke at length with him. He's a very kind of curmudgeonly guy. He's still a skeptic, and I would ask him things like, well, I understand your theory about the science, but did it give you any pause that every other scientist who actually studies this issue disagrees with you? And he would say things like, well, they're bad scientists. He didn't use that word, but they're bad scientists, and I'm a great scientist essentially. That's the PG version. But at one point I asked him, well, what do you? I sort of admired the brazen, the level of megalomania I found. I've never really encountered anything like it before. I guess I don't spend a lot of time with sort of DC power people. You probably have encountered this, but I almost have to take my hat off. It's like Ahab. But I asked him, well, so am I getting this right? Or do you were single-handedly responsible for thwarting any, our best chance at any kind of global climate agreement? Is that how you see it? That you're one man derailed this global process negotiation? And he sort of laughed and he said, well, I'd like to take credit for that, but no. In fact, his view is that in the negotiations, that the U.S. or he by extension, was the only honest broker in the negotiation. That even if everybody, all the countries gathered, 60, 70 countries gathered, signed this treaty as it was written, that even though it was binding, there was no enforcement mechanism strong enough to compel every country to hit those benchmarks, and that essentially it was a face-saving exercise. And the U.S. refused to go along with that. Now, I think, you can't, it's hard for me to take his scientific views seriously, but I think you do have to take seriously the sort of geopolitical cynicism. But I think, on the other hand, the counter-argument is, well, in 1989, the U.S. occupied this unique position of global power. Soviet Union had just fallen. The U.S. was also the largest emitter of greenhouse gases. And if there was a president who made this the priority and wanted to apply pressure, whatever form it took, at the time, then I think we would have been certainly on a much better trajectory than we are now. But of course, we'll never know.
I have so many other things I want to ask you. I'm going to ask you one more question, and then we're going to turn to everybody else's questions. And one of the things, I just want to commend you, because I think the book is so focused in a nice way. You don't veer off and talk about Exxon Valdez or things that were related and sort of that I sort of recall from this period of time. But it's not about that. It's about this very focused moment. But I will ask you. You were recently on Christiana Amanpour's show on PBS, and she asked you about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. I'm guessing this might even be something the audience is interested in, given all my students at USC are very interested in her. And you talked about the Green New Deal, and you said she gets it. Could this be a moment? Obviously, there's political things, but if you have young people who are invested in this in a new way, it's really not too late.
There's been a profound shift that has occurred even since I wrote the magazine article. I was able to write about it in the book, and I think it really dates to after the midterm election. To take a step back, I think the political lesson that I take from this history is that there is a limit to an effectiveness to the appeal to reason, which is how I would characterize the activist argument, the political argument for action on climate that was first really formulated by Rafe Pomerantz and James Hansen. And the appeal to reason is, we have the science. Science is settled. 1979, that's established. We know what we need to do, move away from fossil fuels, basically. And we know that if we don't act now, it'll get much worse. And essentially, it's illogical not to start taking action. And you see that argument in a higher pitch as the decade goes along. By 1988, James Hansen says, not only do we know the science, but we're seeing evidence in the global temperature records now. It's no longer a theory, it's happening. You see it with Al Gore later on in Inconvenient Truth, 15 years later. He's saying, we have the science and now we have charts and more data and all the rest. And it's really the argument that has continued until about 6 months ago. And I think the argument that, if anything, it's gone backwards. It's the science is real, the science is real. That's sort of the first step of that. What is, I think, so valuable and important about Green New Deal, the way that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez talks about it, but also the way Greta Thunberg, the Swedish activist who's been leading these a student who's been leading these walkouts for climate action, they are using a very different kind of argument. Of course, they're saying we know we should act, and it's crazy not to act. But they're also saying, like Ocasio-Cortez last week said, if we don't act, there will be blood on our hands. Greta Thunberg says, you are stealing our future away from, it's usually directed at older people in power. You're stealing our future away from us. You are killing us. You see this in the words of the people in the Sunrise Movement when they sat in at Nancy Pelosi's office after the midterm demanding action. You're killing us. It's a very different kind of argument. I'm scared for my future. It's a more emotional argument, it's more powerful, and it's a moral argument. And I think it's a more honest argument. And I think that it politically, it may be more effective as well. And it says, not only are we afraid, but it says that if we fail to act, we're betraying the very principles that we consider as the fundamental values of our civilization. And who are we? If we can't act on this, then we're betraying everything we stand for. And so it's understanding of the issue as a social justice problem. And I think that has already had a dramatic effect. How far it will go and whether it's sufficient by itself to move the needle politically, that remains to be seen.
Could keep going, but we will now go to your questions. There are microphones somewhere. If you have a question, please go. We'll try, if everybody can just be brief, that would be great, and make sure that your question ends in a question mark.
Hi, thank you both for being here. I'm sure that everyone in the audience has a greater understanding of what happened in this decade and also what we can learn from it and the challenge that we face today. And I wanted to ask, Nathaniel, you didn't get to this just chronologically in your book, but I was surprised reading your book that the politicization of climate change, or global warming as it was called, wasn't really happening yet, and that Bush had actually run on almost like a global warming campaign. And I was wondering if in your research or in the conversations that you've had researching for this book, if you have any insights on when that politicization of climate change started happening in the Republican Party, and if you also see the trend of that sort of coming back, because young Republicans are actually disagreeing with their older people in power and are still fighting for climate change.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not to say that all Republicans were in favor of this, and certainly the record of Republicans on environmental issues during this decade was not great, but there was a segment of the party that did consider themselves environmentalists, thought of environmentalism as a form of conservatism, had a conservative argument, we're protecting our resources and so on. I think the real shift happens as an effect of the oil and gas industry's launch of this propaganda campaign, which I write about, which the authors of that strategy, spoke freely about it to me. Essentially, after Hansen testifies, the people at the highest levels of American Petroleum Institute, the big oil and gas trade group, and Exxon start to say to themselves, well, we need to have a response because it seems inevitable that some kind of policy is coming down the line. Even Bush is talking about it, vowing to do something. So the first turn is they essentially treat it like they do most environmental and health concerns that they face, which is to say, we want to be an active participant in the conversation. We have to burnish our credentials as good scientists, so we have to be up on the science. We have to emphasize uncertainty where it exists, which is not the same as saying the whole science is uncertain, but emphasizing those places where there was some uncertainty about future predictions. We can't let policy go beyond the science, and sort of the real turn is we can't endorse any policy that hurts the bottom line. That's the beginning. And then as a kind of side project, they start to have, in the API's press office, finds a few scientists, at first it's 3 or 4 people, literally, who can be relied upon to talk to reporters and make these arguments. And all of a sudden, you asked about sort of journalistic failures. It played right into this journalistic sort of fetish we have, especially in this country, of this both sides idea, and an issue that didn't have 2 sides, that was just about panic. 1988, it's panic, and what are we going to do? All of a sudden, by 1989, you start seeing these articles saying, maybe this is overblown, maybe there isn't scientific consensus. And it's remarkable, because it's the same 3 or 4 guys showing up over and over again. The head of the API environmental unit that was running this told me that he paid $2,000 for op-eds, for them to write op-eds, and for national publications. And so that's the beginning, and then over the 90s, they push it further and further, and more and more money is spent, more and more it turns into more and more of a partisan issue, until you get, by the end of the 90s, really, into this full-fledged delirium of denialism. But you even have John McCain running against Obama on cap and trade. That was sort of the end of that. But it persisted for a while. But the question is, yes, is it how for all of its, that it does seem like a central tenet of the party, is it dislodgeable? And I think it is. I think in the same way, I don't think it has the salience for the average, Republican voter as something like, abortion does. The same way that I think on the left, people have not prioritized it as much as I think it should be prioritized. I think on the right, it's also not something that is that central to the way most Republicans think about how they vote. And so I do think there is an opportunity for that to shift. I don't think it's fated to be a partisan issue. And I think, in fact, any kind of reasonable person who looks at it and understands the science, even basically, can only conclude that it's not a partisan issue.
And as voters, you all have the power. Next question. Hands.
Hello. Hi. Thank you so much for coming. I heard this anecdotally, so it might be false, but it goes into a question. I was hearing that Rick Perry apparently has been under the table passing progressive climate legislation, while vocally he's still a climate change denier. So I just wanted to ask, as far as the Republicans go and climate change deniers in general, how many of them do you think actually believe what they're saying, and how many of them think, that they can just pay their way out of it to colonize the moon or whatever? Thanks.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And that's sort of the moral question, is when you hear these politicians like Rick Perry saying, well, maybe the climate is changing, but I don't think human beings are responsible. Are they being sincere? My sense is that almost to a man, they're not. I think the most charitable interpretation could be that they're, and this might work for Perry, is that they're just ignorant of the issue. I think Sununu is interesting because I think he really is sincere. At the end of the day, maybe it's irrelevant. I think he really believes it, or disbelieves it. But no, I don't think for the most part that this is a sincerely held position. I think it's it's what's most expedient, and I think that's another reason why it can be maybe more easily altered. And I don't expect national Republicans to start to come to Jesus about it. But I do feel that I think normal people, I think, are a lot easier to shift. And I think some of the conversation around the Green New Deal actually has had that effect. If you look at, I don't like citing polls, but it does seem that there has been significant movement just in the last 6 months on the issue. And of course, it's not like this hasn't happened before in American history. We've had huge sea changes in views on social issues before. I mean, the most recent example, not a perfect analogy, but think of gay marriage, which, the Republicans were using as a wedge to get Republicans to vote. Well, that shifted really quickly, and I think conversations between young people and their parents and grandparents was a big part of that. Of course, there's more to it than that, but I do think that kind of shift is starting to change. People are speaking about it in moral terms, and I think that's the first step.
Hello again. So my question is, time and time again, we can see it in the Green New Deal, for example. You present a solution to help combat climate change, and a lot of the opposition is not on, yes, we should be prioritizing the earth, but it's going to be very costly. It's going to cost a lot of money, the finances, and even, in my own sustainability efforts, when students try to present issues, again, the costs to the institution are always brought up as like the first kind of line of defense. So I guess through all your research and your opinion, how do you deal with that first pushback?
Yeah, I just think of William Nordhaus, for instance, who was thinking about the economics of climate change back in the mid-'70s, just won the Nobel Prize, the father of carbon pricing, basically. He said upon winning the Nobel, it's economically beneficial. This is what sort of anyone who studies this will say. It's technologically possible. It's smart economically. The question is one of political will. James Hansen would say the same thing. The clarity of that argument, I think, is something that's shifted from the 80s. Of course, it's not good if you run a coal company, but broadly speaking, there are new studies that come out all the time that action will benefit GDP by X trillions of dollars, or global growth by X trillions of dollars. Just this week, there was a paper about how much countries in sort of warmer countries have lost in terms of GDP already from climate change. And so I think the economic argument, without getting too much into the weeds, is strong. And I think that that is a kind of reflexive, dispute that you'll hear from the right, but I don't think that the evidence in the economic literature bears it out. It's a distraction, I think, to try to engage with that kind of argument.
Well, that's a good way for me to say that reading this book will help educate you, and you can help educate everyone else. Thank you to Nathaniel Rich for this terrific book, great conversation. Thanks to Scripps Presents, and there will be a book signing out in the lobby. Thanks to all of you.